All right, get ready for a wild ride because we're about to take a deep dive into a story that's as twisted as it is fascinating. We're going deep on the case of Daft Peter, the arsonist who terrorized Hull, England. You ready for this?
Oh, absolutely. This case is a roller coaster, full of unexpected turns and dark secrets, and it really shows you how appearances can be so deceiving.
Yeah, we're talking about Peter Dinsdale, a seemingly harmless young man. He even later changed his name to Bruce Lee. But behind that unassuming exterior, there was this a dangerous obsession with fire, and it would lead to a string of devastating arson attacks, multiple deaths.
And what makes this case even more fascinating, I think, is the social context, right? It all happened in Hull in the 70s and 80s, a city that was dealing with poverty, social unrest, and all these really complicated community dynamics.
Yeah, it's like the backdrop of the story is almost as important as the story itself. So let's rewind to the beginning. Peter Dinsdale, his childhood, it wasn't exactly a fairy tale.
No, not at all.
He was abandoned by his parents at a young age, then he was raised by his grandmother. But from what we know, she wasn't really equipped to handle, the care and support a young boy needs.
Right, and you can imagine how that neglect, on top of the bullying he endured because of his physical disabilities,
Right.
probably had a huge impact on his psychological development. It's like picture growing up feeling isolated, unwanted, and powerless.
It's a recipe for, well, for some serious internal
Yeah.
struggles, right?
Yeah.
And on top of that, he also suffered from epileptic fits, which just made things worse, further alienated him from his peers, and probably made him feel like a total outcast.
Yeah, it's no surprise then that he found some kind of comfort in something that gave him a feeling of, well, control, a sense of power, and that was fire. It was like his outlet, his way of expressing all that anger, frustration, and maybe even, and this is going to sound weird, but maybe even a twisted form of like artistic expression.
Yeah, it's like fire became his language, a way to communicate with a world that wasn't really listening to him. And his fascination with fire, it started really early.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking 9 years old. He burned down a timber yard.
Wow.
This wasn't just some kid messing around with matches. It was a sign of something much deeper, a real obsession.
Absolutely. Fire became his way of interacting with the world, making his mark, even though it was, well, a destructive one. And as he got older, this fascination with fire, it just morphed into something darker, more dangerous.
And this is where things get really, really interesting. Dinsdale, he was clever, like cunning even.
Mm.
He created this daft persona, acting slow and simple, and it allowed him to just fly under the radar.
It was a brilliant tactic, even if it was, disturbing. He played the fool, and people underestimated him, dismissed him. It's like he was a ghost, moving through the community unnoticed.
And this brings us to the Hasty family, a family that was, well, let's just say they were notorious in Hull, known for their less than stellar reputation. They seemed to attract trouble like a magnet.
The Hasty family, yeah, they were, to put it nicely, a force to be reckoned with. They were known for their, well, let's say their boisterous behavior, their frequent run-ins with the law, and their, let's say their general disregard for what most people consider normal. They weren't exactly winning any popularity contests.
Right. They were like the black sheep of the community, always stirring up trouble.
Yeah.
So who was at the head of this chaotic clan?
Well, the patriarch, he was William Hasty. He was described as a tough, no-nonsense kind of guy who ruled his household with an iron fist.
Yeah, the stereotypical tough guy dad. And what about the mom? What was she like?
Oh, she was Edith, and she was no shrinking violet, that's for sure. Known for her sharp tongue, her fiery temper, and she was totally devoted to her family no matter what trouble they got into.
Sounds like she could hold her own. And their kids, what were they like?
Well, let's just say each one seemed to be more rambunctious than the last. They were a constant source of gossip and, let's say, concern for their neighbors.
A recipe for chaos, for sure. So you've got this family, the Hasties, living on the edge of society, always pushing boundaries. It's like they were living by their own set of rules.
Yeah, it's like they were a thorn in the side of the community, this constant source of disruption and unease.
And then, enter, stage left, Daft Peter, or as he was known back then, Bruce Lee. And he gets mixed up with this family, specifically with one of the sons, Charlie Hasty.
And this relationship, it takes a dark turn pretty quickly. We're talking blackmail, a dangerous game of power and manipulation.
Right, it's like a collision course, two very different worlds colliding. Charlie discovers a secret about Bruce Lee, something that could expose his true nature, shatter that carefully constructed daft persona. And Charlie, well, he uses this to his advantage. He starts extorting money from Lee, holding this secret over his head like a sword.
It's the classic predator becoming the prey. Lee, who is so good at manipulating and deceiving others, suddenly finds himself trapped in a web of his own making.
But there's another layer to this story, another layer that makes it even more complicated. Bruce Lee had this secret infatuation with Charlie's sister, Angie.
Oh, right. I'd almost forgotten about that.
He was totally smitten with her, but she wasn't interested. She kept rejecting him.
So you've got this potent mix of blackmail, unrequited love, and this simmering resentment, and it's all swirling around this already volatile family dynamic. It's like a powder keg waiting to explode.
And then it happens. December 4th, 1979, the Hasty family home, it goes up in flames. A raging inferno that takes the lives of 3 young boys, Charlie, Paul, and Peter.
It was a horrible tragedy that just shocked the entire community, a horrific event that demanded answers. And in the middle of all the chaos and grief, one name keeps popping up.
Bruce Lee. The guy who was connected to the family had a motive and a history of, well, playing with fire. Quite literally.
Right, and that's where our deep dive really begins. We're going to try and unravel the mystery of Bruce Lee, explore the twisted path that led him to this point, and try to understand how he managed to stay hidden in plain sight for so long.
The Hasty fire, it really was a turning point in all of this. I mean, the intensity of the blaze, the loss of those young lives, it put so much pressure on the police to find some answers.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, right, public sentiment, it wasn't exactly on the Hasty family side at that point.
No, their reputation, it definitely preceded them. They were viewed as, a problem family, always stirring up trouble. Some people even consider them a menace to society, like they were just bad news.
So with all that going on, when the police started digging into the case, who were the prime suspects? Who did they zero in on? Well, it might seem obvious now, but at the time, the Hasties themselves, they were at the top of the list. It seemed almost too perfect, right? A lot of people just assumed their lifestyle, their choices had finally caught up with them. Maybe it was revenge, an enemy settling a score, or maybe some kind of internal family feud gone wrong. It wouldn't have been that surprising to people.
And the police actually followed those leads, right? They had a witness, at least initially, who claimed they saw a getaway car, 2 men fleeing the scene.
Yeah, but that witness testimony, it turned out to be unreliable. Just another dead end in a case that was already full of them.
So while the police were busy chasing those leads, trying to make sense of the family's enemies, Bruce Lee, he was just sort of blending back into the background.
And that's what makes him so cunning. He was a master manipulator playing everyone. He knew how people saw the Hasty family, he knew they had a bad reputation, and he used that to his advantage. He was the invisible man, the one nobody suspected because everyone was looking in the wrong direction.
It's like a magic trick, right? He made himself disappear by directing attention somewhere else.
Exactly.
So amidst all this chaos, the investigation takes a turn. The police start looking into Hull's, its underbelly, specifically the city's rent boy network.
Yeah.
That wasn't something people talked about openly back then, was it?
No, it was a hidden world, a secret network of young men who were engaging in prostitution. It was risky, operating in the shadows, and it often drew in vulnerable and desperate individuals.
And that's where Charlie Hasty comes back into the picture, right? He was involved in this network.
Right. He was young, leading this dangerous double life, and it was this connection that ultimately led the police to Bruce Lee.
Because remember, Charlie had been blackmailing Lee, threatening to expose their relationship.
Exactly. So Lee, he knew the game was up, he was cornered, trapped, and under intense interrogation, he finally broke. He confessed to setting the Hasty house on fire. His story was that it was revenge against Charlie for the blackmail.
But if we really look closely at his motives, they seem a lot more complicated than just simple revenge, wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's a whole other layer to the story that adds a really unsettling dimension to Lee's character.
His infatuation with Angie Hasty, Charlie's sister.
Right, the unrequited love angle. He was completely obsessed with her, but she wanted nothing to do with him.
It seems like his confession, the one about the Hasty fire, it wasn't just about getting back at Charlie. It was also about, getting rid of a rival, removing the obstacle that was standing in his way.
It's classic, really, a dangerous obsession spiraling out of control. He was so fixated on Angie that he was willing to do anything to get her, even if it meant resorting to violence to arson.
And once that confession came out, it was like opening a floodgate. Bruce Lee started admitting to other fires, other deaths. He confessed to the fire that killed 6-year-old Richard Ellerton, who he knew from the school for handicapped children they both attended. And then he admitted to setting fire to the home of Arthur Smee, a 72-year-old recluse. Lee poured paraffin all over the front room where the man was sleeping. The poor guy never had a chance.
It's like he couldn't stop himself. Once that first confession came out, it was like a dam had burst, and all this guilt and the truth about his crimes just came pouring out.
And we aren't talking about just a few isolated incidents here, right?
Mm-hmm.
He confessed to a whole series of fires spanning years, each one more shocking than the last.
That's right, and each one with its own set of disturbing details. He described setting fire to the home of David Brewer, a 34-year-old man who was unable to work because of an injury he got on the job. Apparently, Lee held a grudge against Brewer from an argument they had, all because of pigeons.
Pigeons. Seriously, it's almost funny, like in a dark, twisted way.
I know, right? It really shows you how impulsive he was, how he would lash out at people for the smallest reasons.
And then there were the fires that resulted in deaths, like the one that killed 13-month-old Andrew while his parents were out, and the fire that killed 13-year-old Deborah Jordan and 7-year-old Mark Gold, and the fire that killed a mother and her 3 young sons. All those innocent lives lost because of his obsession with fire.
It's a pattern of destruction, a trail of tragedy that reveals just how deeply disturbed he was.
And in one of his confessions, he talked about how he would often hang around at the scene of his crimes, watching as the firefighters tried to put out the flames, as families grieved their losses. It's like he was a spectator, getting some sort of twisted satisfaction from the chaos and suffering he'd caused.
It's one of the most disturbing things about him, isn't it? He wasn't just setting fires, he was enjoying the destruction, he was feeding off the pain of others.
And then there's the Winsley Lodge fire, an old people's home. 11 elderly men lost their lives in that blaze. In his confession, Bruce Lee claimed he didn't know it was a care facility, that he just wanted to burn down a big house.
Yeah, that confession, though, that would later become a major source of controversy and debate.
Right, and we'll definitely get into that in a bit. But first, I think we need to look at how the police, using these confessions, began to put the pieces together.
They were finally starting to realize that this wasn't some petty arsonist. They were dealing with a serial fire starter, someone who was very dangerous and had been hiding in plain sight for years.
And he'd become Britain's most prolific serial killer. His crimes even overshadowed the Yorkshire Ripper, who was also active in the area at the same time.
It was a case that really shook the nation, a stark reminder that evil can lurk anywhere, even in the most ordinary places, often hidden beneath a mask of normalcy.
Okay, so we've got this seemingly simple guy, Bruce Lee, confessing to all these horrific arson attacks. What happens next?
Well, he's deemed mentally fit to stand trial, which is already kind of a controversial decision, considering his background and that whole daft persona he had going on. But he ends up pleading not guilty to 26 counts of murder, but guilty to 26 counts of manslaughter, his defense being diminished responsibility.
Wait, hold on a second. Diminished responsibility. Can you explain what that means in this context?
Sure, it's a legal defense, basically. It acknowledges the crime, but argues that the defendant's mental state at the time prevented them from fully understanding what they were doing, the consequences of their actions. So in Lee's case, his lawyers were saying, yes, he set the fires, but he wasn't really in control of his actions. He wasn't thinking straight.
So the court accepted that argument.
Well, not entirely. He was sentenced to indefinite detention in a maximum security mental hospital. It was a compromise, really, a sentence that aimed to both punish him and protect the public.
It sounds like they were trying to find a balance, acknowledging his mental state while also holding him accountable for his actions.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the end of the story, was it? His case continued to generate a lot of attention, especially from the media.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Publications like the Sunday Times, they started digging into the case, and they found some things that didn't add up. They started questioning the validity of Lee's confessions, pointing out inconsistencies, and suggesting that maybe the police were too quick to believe him, especially given his intellectual limitations.
So they were basically saying that maybe he was coerced into confessing, or that maybe he didn't fully understand what he was confessing to.
Yeah, something like that. They also argued that physically he wouldn't have been able to pull off some of the arson attacks he had confessed to. And then there was the whole controversy surrounding the Winsley Lodge fire.
Right, that one was particularly messy. He claimed he didn't know it was a care home when he set the fire.
His lawyers argued that his confession was unreliable, that the evidence actually pointed to an accidental cause.
And they won that argument, right? The Court of Appeal overturned his conviction for the Winsley Lodge fire.
They did. But they upheld his other convictions, stating that those confessions were credible and supported by the evidence. It left a lot of people feeling uncertain, wondering if justice had really been served.
Yes, one of those cases where there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
And what about Bruce Lee? What happened to him? Where is he now?
Well, he actually goes by the name Peter Treat now, and he's still incarcerated. But here's the thing. He's completely recanted all his
Are you
confessions.
saying he's innocent?
Yeah, he claims he was pressured by the police and that he didn't actually do any of it.
Wow, that's a pretty big twist. So after all these years, all the investigations, the trial, the appeals, we're still left with more questions than answers.
That's the thing about this case. It's full of twists and turns, ethical dilemmas, legal complexities. It really makes you think about criminal behavior, about how the justice system works or doesn't work in some cases.
And it definitely challenges our perceptions, right? The case of Daft Peter. It shows how easy it is to be deceived by appearances, how even the most unassuming individuals can be hiding dark secrets.
And it reminds us that sometimes, even after all the investigations and trials, the truth remains elusive, buried under all these layers of conflicting evidence, unreliable confessions, and societal biases. It's a case that really stays with you.
It certainly does. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the case of Daft Peter, the arsonist who terrorized Hull. We hope you found it as fascinating and thought-provoking as we did. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of the world around us.